On April the 4th, 1967, the great American civil rights leader, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., delivered a speech to a gathering of an organisation called Clergy and Laity Concerned About Vietnam at Riverside Church in New York City. Professing his wholehearted agreement with the aims and work of this organisation, King recounted how, over the preceding 2 years, he had moved to, quote, break the betrayal of my own silences on the war. Many had questioned the wisdom of him doing so, he said, fearing it would detract from his focus on civil rights. But coming out against the war, King retorted, was not only consistent with the ongoing commission to peacemaking implicit in the Nobel Peace Prize he had received in 1964, it was also consistent with his commitment to the ministry of Jesus Christ. To me, the relationship of this ministry to the making of peace is so obvious, he said, that I sometimes marvel at those who ask me why I am speaking against the war. King proceeded to deplore the dishonourableness of America's intentions in Vietnam and to detail the enormous suffering 3 decades of war had inflicted on the people of that blighted peninsula. He called for an end to aerial bombardment, the declaration of a unilateral ceasefire, the opening of negotiations with the Viet Cong, and the setting of a firm date for the withdrawal of all foreign troops from the country. He also proposed that all young men in America should register as conscientious objectors and encouraged all ministers of religion to give up their ministerial exemptions from military service and also to enrol as conscientious objectors. But King went further still. True to his trade as a preacher and a public prophet, he asserted that the war in Vietnam was but a symptom of a far deeper malady in the American spirit. If America's soul becomes totally poisoned, he said, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam. A nation that is prepared to send its poor Negro and white boys to kill and die together in the villages of Southeast Asia, but is unable to seat them together in the same schools or to house them in the same city blocks, is a nation in spiritual decline. A country that chooses to invest its vast wealth and resources in the demonic destructiveness of militarism rather than in rehabilitating the poor is, he said, a society gone mad on war. What America needed, King declared, is a radical revolution of values, entailing a shift from being a thing-oriented society to becoming a person-oriented society, and accompanied by a reordering of priorities so that the pursuit of peace takes precedence over the pursuit of war. Without such a moral and spiritual revolution, America will never be able to conquer the giant triplets of racism, militarism, and materialism. King continued with these memorable words. A true revolution of values, I haven't got his accent, I'm sorry, but just imagine his Southern American accent. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho Road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It is not haphazard and superficial. It comes to see that an edifice that produces beggars needs restructuring. A true revolution will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth and say, this is not just. A true revolution of values will say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's homes with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into the veins of people normally humane, of sending men from dark and bloody battlefields physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more on military defence than on programs of spiritual uplift is approaching spiritual death. The Vietnam era, of course, is over, and many things have changed in American society since. But Dr. King's searing critique of American militarism and its inextricable relationship with racism and social injustice remains as pertinent today as it did 40 years ago. Read Iraq or Afghanistan in place of Vietnam, and it could have been delivered just last week. The speech is also an instructive example of a particular way of approaching Christian social engagement. The speech is fundamentally an anti-war homily, not an analysis of domestic, social, and political policy. But King refuses to compartmentalise the nature of justice and moves backwards and forwards between the tragedy of Vietnam and the violence and poverty of America's ghettos as two sides of the same coin. King explains that one of the things that impelled him to raise his voice against the war was the incongruity of commending non-violent social change to the desperate, rejected and angry young men on the streets of America's cities, while the American government modelled a way of solving its problems overseas through employing, his words, massive doses of violence. So King's style of social commentary is one that exposes the interconnectedness of all spheres of collective life and insists on the need for consistency between what the state expects of its citizens and how the state itself acts. A second noteworthy feature of King's approach is that he does not begin with some speculative theory of justice or a pre-cast list of ethical principles or human rights that he then applies to social reality in order to determine an appropriate course of action. Instead, King begins, on the one hand, with a personal confession of his own complicity in the problems he is describing, and on the other hand, with an account again grounded in vivid personal experience of concrete situations of poverty, violence, racism, and injustice, both at home and abroad. What justice requires, King assumes, cannot be discerned in the abstract from the safe distance of a policy analyst or an academic specialist or a theological student for that matter. It can only be discovered by looking squarely at the actual embodied suffering of the victims of oppression and questioning the structural arrangements that perpetuate their suffering. A third feature of King's approach to social engagement is his appeal to religious or spiritual resources to envision change. He speaks of his own commitment to Jesus Christ and emphasises the universal brotherhood, indeed the divine sonship of all people under God's fatherhood. Along with quotes from President Kennedy, Arnold Toynbee, and several black poets, King quotes two biblical texts verbatim and alludes to a third, the third being the parable of the Good Samaritans. This is just a long introduction to where I want to go. It's this third allusion that is most interesting and has been most frequently quoted by Christian social activists. King's memorable words make the point that while doing works of compassion is an important part of the Christian calling, by itself, they are not enough. They must be accompanied by a transformation of the social structures that generate poverty and violence in the first place by a repaving of the Jericho Road. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, he writes, but that will only be an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho Road must be transformed, so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey along life's highway. King's point that there is more to Christian mission than patching up the victims of structural injustice is absolutely correct. As well as being good Samaritans, we have to ask why the road from Jerusalem to Jericho is so damn dangerous in the first place. But there's still a huge amount for us to learn about the nature of justice and the task of Christian social engagement by attending closely to the actions of the Good Samaritan himself. And this is what I want to do in the time that remains. And I'm just drawing on part of my recent book where I spend something like 150 pages on this parable. So this is just a taste. Of all the stories that Jesus told, none has been absorbed more deeply into the moral and legal traditions of Western civilization than the parable of the Good Samaritan. The story is well known to us all. It tells of a man who was brutally assaulted on a trip from Jerusalem to Jericho and left for dead on the side of the road. Two passing temple officials noticed the unconscious man in the ditch, but instead of stopping to help, they crossed to the other side of the road and carry on their way. Next, a travelling Samaritan happens upon the victim. He's moved with compassion at what he sees. He bandages the man's wounds, lifts him onto his donkey, and transports him to a nearby inn where he takes care of him overnight. The following day, the Samaritan resumes his journey, but only after paying the innkeeper in advance to continue nursing the injured man back to health. So you know the story. The impact of this parable, I discovered when I worked on it, the impact of this parable has been immense. Its influence far exceeds the boundaries of strictly religious or theological discourse. The parable still figures frequently as a starting point for discussions in moral philosophy and social psychology about altruism and the nature of social responsibility, while in legal theory it continues to inform debates about the relationship between morality and law and the scope of personal liability. It's also played a huge role in medical ethics and in shaping the practice codes of several helping professions. It's frequently cited to encourage charitable pursuits in the local community and to support philanthropy on the global stage, especially in the form of emergency aid and relief assistance. In the political arena, Good Samaritanism has been used to justify military interventions in other countries for humanitarian reasons, or to uphold human rights, or to remedy failed states. Most recently, it has figured in debates about immigration, the treatment of asylum seekers, and the obligations of hospitality towards displaced populations. The intellectual and cultural legacy of the parable has therefore been enormous. As one observer once remarked, the parable of the Good Samaritan has built hospitals all over the world, and if it were truly heeded, it would end racism, eliminate national hatreds, and abolish war. In my book, I seek to explore the implications of this parable for developing a Christian theory of restorative justice, which is a personal interest of mine, of course. That the parable has a particular pertinence to the theme of restorative justice is apparent in at least four ways. First, and perhaps most obvious, the story deals with an episode of criminal violence. And as we will see in a moment, it affords quite remarkable insight into the experience of criminal victimization. Second, the story reflects extensively on the duty of care owed to the victims of crime by others in the community. More words are devoted to describing the actions of the Samaritan than to those of the two temple officials combined. His compassionate deeds are spelled out in extraordinary detail because each individual action helps to define what is entailed in restoring victims to wholeness and autonomy following the tragedy they have suffered. Third, it is hugely significant, for my purposes in particular, that the parable is told in response to a question from a lawyer about how to gain eternal life and about the scope of provisions in biblical law legislating care for one's neighbour. This actually is the only parable in the Gospels that is expressly used to explain or defend an item of legal interpretation. The entire narrative is in fact saturated with legal terminology, allusions, procedures and assumptions, which commentators invariably miss. There's no time to lay out in detail here, but which reinforce the relevance of this parable to the questions of legal theory and practice. I also don't have time here to examine a fourth way in which the parable bears on the concerns of criminal justice. The fourth way is this: the fact that Jesus deliberately casts a hated national enemy, a Samaritan, as the one who upholds God's law and fulfills the love commandment directly challenges our propensity to categorize people dualistically as friend or foe, citizen or foreigner, good or bad, guilty or innocent, even as victim or offender. The parable subverts our tendency to divide the world simplistically into goodies and baddies, and it teaches that goodness may even be found in those we most often regard as evil. Nowhere is this lesson more relevant today than in the sphere of crime and justice. So my contention then is that the parable has much to say about crime, about the rule of law, and restorative justice. What I want to do here, however, is focus on just two dimensions of the parable: the insights it affords into the bitter experience of victimization, what it means experientially to be a victim of injustice or brutality, and the remarkable depiction it provides of what is required to restore victims to well-being. Now, in both respects, the parable deals primarily with criminal victimization and repair, but its insights are equally applicable to other kinds of victimization, such as being the victim of family violence, which is a criminal offence, but you know what I mean, or social injustice, or racial discrimination, or political oppression, or countless other kinds of systemic evil. Research shows that victims of human malice, in whatever form it takes, have many similar reactions and needs. And I'm sure you'll be able to transfer much of the parable's message into your own sphere of interest and ministry, even if it's not to do with crime and justice. So I want to talk about the bitterness of victimization. The story opens with a certain man, it's all we're told about him, a certain man, setting out on a journey from Jerusalem to Jericho, about 23 kilometres away. Nothing is said about the man's religious, ethnic, or social identity. He is simply a man, an anthropos, a human. The road he travelled was steep and treacherous, twisting through barren terrain that was honeycombed with caves and gullies that provided ample hiding places for the many robbers who infested the area. It was extremely dangerous territory to pass through and remained so for most of its subsequent history. The journey would normally have taken at least 6 hours to complete on foot. But on this occasion, the man's progress is cut short by a violent attack. The Greek word used for his assailants indicates that they are not opportunistic thieves, but well-armed brigands or outlaws who preyed on the vulnerable travellers in the countryside. Social banditry was a major problem at the time. Unemployed workers or peasants driven off their land through debt or famine or excessive taxation resorted to brigandage to survive, and their primary victims were the ruling elites whom they held responsible for their plight. Some commentators suggest that Jesus' first hearers would have felt immediate sympathy for the highwaymen mentioned in the parable, viewing them as Robin Hood type figures who struggled valiantly against social and political oppression. This seems fanciful to me. The penalty for brigandage was death, and fear of being attacked by bandits was widespread in the populace. Besides, the parable scarcely portrays the robbers in a positive light. They are responsible for extreme violence against a nameless victim whose simple humanity is highlighted, while his social rank is left deliberately ambiguous. It's ambiguous because the only thing seized from him by his attackers is his clothing. In addition to beating him, they stripped him. In the ancient world, clothing was a consistent indicator of wealth and status. So it's possible that the stripping of the victim implies that he was a wealthy man whose expensive clothing was worth stealing. On the other hand, it could indicate that he was so poor that the only thing he possessed were the rags on his back, which the bandits took in spiteful frustration. Whatever his social rank, the man is treated cruelly by his assailants and left for dead. The dramatic description of his attack captures no fewer than 5 common elements of the experience of criminal victimization. These need to be spelled out clearly at the beginning of the story, because if the man is ever to be restored to well-being, each dimension of his victimization will need to be addressed. Now, if I had the PowerPoint, I have all these phrases on the screen, so you just have to listen carefully, because each of these points really refers to a phrase in the description. So I'm describing the way in which the victim experience is depicted. First, and most basically, his victimization was an occasion of profound disempowerment. He fell into the hands of robbers. Without warning, total strangers invade his life, disrupt his normal routine, seize control of his person, and reduce him to abject impotence. From this point on, the man is portrayed as completely passive, utterly dependent on the goodwill of others for his very survival. He is radically disempowered by his assailants. That is what being a victim is fundamentally about: an enforced, uninvited, crippling, debilitating powerlessness. Second, his victimization was an experience of physical violation. They beat him, literally to within an inch of his life, leaving him half dead, is the word used. The phrase used here for his beating is the same expression used for the ferocious flogging dished out to Paul and Silas in the Philippian jail in Acts 16. The word half dead is exceedingly rare in biblical Greek, though there is a striking parallel in a later papyrus document where a woman lays a complaint about an episode of domestic violence in which her brother and sister-in-law, quote, nearly killed me by the number of blows and left me half dead. So clearly the traveller is subjected to severe violence. His bodily integrity is brutally violated by his attackers, and he is discarded like a worthless piece of garbage. Later, his rescuer will bandage his oozing wounds before attempting to move him to safety. Third, his victimization was an experience of psychological humiliation. They stripped him. Clothing in the ancient world was an essential means of signalling one's wealth, class, or religious role, and the ability to recognize one's social peers by their appearance was enormously important. Wearing ornate clothing was a sign of personal dignity, honor, and status, whilst being stripped of clothing was a sign of humiliation and degradation. Of course, what happened to Jesus on his trial, he was stripped. This is what happens to the victim as well. In being stripped naked and left exposed on the roadside, he is profoundly humiliated. He's not only robbed of personal dignity by this act, he's also deprived of a social belonging, because with his clothing went all available markers of his ethnic identity and social location. Naked and unconscious and therefore unable to speak, all external clues as to his individual or cultural identity are taken away. He is reduced to an absolute minimum, an exposed, anonymous, insensible human being whose only claim on anyone else's attention is his misery. Fourth, the victim's experience is one of social isolation. They went away, leaving him. He is left alone in a lonely place to die a lonely, lingering, solitary death. So isolated is he that it's only, verse 31, by chance that his battered and bruised body is seen by anyone at all. Even then, the first people who come across him elect to leave him in his abandoned state. He is twice forsaken, first by his attackers, then by his potential rescuers, whose indifference to his plight is a cruelty of equal magnitude. Victims of severe violence often speak of the disconnection they feel from those around them, even from close friends and acquaintances who are unable or unwilling to fathom their pain, to bridge the gap to their desolate condition. The aloneness they experienced in being singled out by their assailant for harming and hurting is continued in a profound sense of aloneness and struggling with its aftermath. The sense of abandonment or forsakenness is perhaps the profoundest form of grief. I once heard Judge Carolyn Henwood, who's a district court judge in New Zealand, who's been involved, in fact there's somebody here, I think, was it yesterday, somebody been involved with this as well, who has been involved in a project where a panel of very distinguished people, and they have to be distinguished people because that adds to the sort of the significance of what they're doing, have provided a kind of listening panel for victims of childhood abuse when they were in state care. So there are thousands of people, something like 60 or 70% of people in prison come from this community. People who, as children, were in state care in orphanages or and so on, who suffered physical or sexual abuse. And one of the strategies that's been used to try and bring some kind of healing is to have this panel of judges and very sort of powerful people sit and listen to their stories. Now, the panel has no power to grant reparation or to agree to prosecute the wrongdoer. They're simply there to listen. There's still a long way to go in this. I went to a conference a few months ago. There's still a long way to go on this journey where victims of childhood abuse in state care desperately want the government to apologise. That there's a felt need until the government or the Governor General even offers a formal apology for the state's failure, that they feel that the issue won't be resolved. But anyway, Judge Henwood made the comment that in listening to hundreds and hundreds of stories of children, of adults who as children had been abused, she said the overwhelming feeling that these stories communicated was the feeling of abandonment. There was nobody there to help. I was completely alone. There was nobody I could turn to. I was utterly forsaken. It is perhaps the profoundest form of of suffering. Finally, the victim's experience is one of enduring vulnerability. They left him half dead. His suffering began at the time of the assault, but his torment is not yet over. For the remainder of the story, and this insight is absolutely crucial to understanding everything that happens hereafter. For the remainder of the story, the victim hovers between life and death. Those who stumble upon him on the road have a choice. They can either, like the priest and the Levite, regard him as good as dead already, probably dead, if not, let's not risk it, and risk contamination, and therefore decide that he's beyond any worthwhile effort to restore, or, like the merciful Samaritan, they can defy the logic of death and against all odds seek to fan the flicker of life back into flame. There's no middle way. Those who encounter victims can either surrender to the logic of destruction unleashed in their lives by the wrong and reckon their powerless and violated, humiliated and abandoned state to be hopeless, or they can strive to bring hope and healing to the victim, however remote they may seem at the time. The first option, of course, is starkly illustrated by the actions of the priest and Levite. The second option is shown by the actions of the Samaritan, who is a very unlikely hero. Jesus' first audience would have been taken aback at the appearance of a Samaritan in the story. They would have probably expected the third character, because there's always three, isn't there? 3 bears, 3 little pigs. There's always 3 characters in folk tales. They would have expected the third character to be an Israelite layman, because the threefold division of priests, Levites, and all the children of Israel was a standard way of summarizing the religious diversity of the nation. So we've got a priest and a Levite. Who's next? Well, one of the children of Israel. But not only does Jesus use a Samaritan in place of an Israelite, he portrays him as responding in a way that puts the Jewish characters to shame. This unlikely character becomes the very embodiment of divine compassion towards the anonymous stranger lying motionless in the ditch. The Samaritan's actions towards the victim are recounted in the parable in exquisite detail because they serve to exemplify exactly what is entailed in loving one's neighbour as oneself. The whole story, of course, is told to illustrate the question of who is my neighbour in biblical law. And what I argue in the book is that the story really spells out the meaning of neighbour love in an incredibly radical way. It pushes neighbour love right into the realm of enemy love and pushes it right beyond the standard categories. For Jesus, neighbour love is more than simple benevolence or showing respect for the equal rights of others. It is rather, I wish it weren't, but it seems to me this is what the story and the text suggest. It is rather, neighbour love for Jesus is rather a love that is to be patterned after our love for God. Just as we are called to love God with all our heart and soul and mind and strength, so we are called to show that same all-encompassing love for others. This is the most staggering feature of the parable and its most disturbing challenge. The Samaritan's display of love is unreserved in its passion and commitment. It exceeds mere charity because it engages all the powers of his personality, his heart, his sight, his heart, his hands, his strength, his time, his possessions, and his intelligence. And so this heading would be dimensions of restorative care. First to be engaged are his eyes. Like the priest and the Levite, he saw the victim. But unlike them, he saw him up close. he drew near to his actual person. Whereas the priest came down that road and the Levite came to the place, the Samaritan drew near to him. Whereas the other travellers looked at the victim superficially, the Samaritan entered more fully into his personal space. The three travellers all had the same physical evidence to go on. For all of them, the naked, motionless body was without visible signs of ethnicity or social status, and for all intents and purposes appeared to be dead. The priest and the Levite used such equivocal evidence as an excuse to do nothing. The Samaritan saw a suffering human being and got involved in rescuing him. Perhaps it is for that reason that the next thing to be engaged was his heart or feelings. He was moved with compassion. This is the crucial turning point in the story. The reference to compassion comes exactly halfway through the narrative, and it shatters the parallelism between the three bypasses. All three see the victim, but only the Samaritan is overcome with compassion. The verb used here denotes a gut-wrenching surge of emotion, a stirring in the innards. In Luke's Gospel, compassion is supremely a divine attribute. Just as God has compassion on expectant Israel and comes to her rescue in sending the Messiah in chapter 1, just as Jesus has compassion when he sees the widow of Nain burying her dead son in chapter 7, just as the father of the prodigal son is filled with compassion when he sees his starving son stumbling up the road and rushes to embrace him, those are the only other three references, so the Samaritan is overcome with compassion when he sees the condition of the battered victim. Compassion expresses a godlike and God-given capacity to empathize with the suffering of others, to enter into their world and share emotionally in their pain while still regarding it as their pain and not your own pain. There's an important sense in which the Samaritan's heart overruled his head. The Samaritan could well have proceeded by way of logical calculation, first determining whether the victim was a fellow Samaritan, then choosing to show love to him. But there's no hint of any such reasoning. His instinctive response is one of compassion, not calculation. The casuistic strategy adopted by the priest and the Levite is simply not part of the Samaritan's moral universe. Of course, having one's heart in the right place is rarely enough in order to genuinely help someone in need. Compassion may inspire the decision to help, but some level of rational analysis is also required to ensure that the help provided will actually prove beneficial. Deciding how to help, in other words, is just as critical as deciding whether to help. In fact, even the decision whether to help is not the automatic product of compassionate feeling. An overpowering surge of emotion may prove paralyzing in an observer. Or, I think more dangerously, and I recognize this in myself as I'm sure you do, sometimes the feeling of compassion is enough to satisfy our moral concern, right? We feel this sense of compassion at the children who have been bombed to pieces in Gaza, and we think, well, I'm a good person because I feel sorry. What's on the other channel? I mean, there's a sense in which the feeling of compassion can be enough to satisfy our moral requirements, and therefore it can fail to generate any tangible results. So while compassion is what motivates the Samaritan, there's more to it than just feeling the feelings. Because for the Samaritan, the next thing that is activated are his hands and his feet. He went and bandaged his wounds. His interior experience of compassion was translated into exterior deeds of deliverance. And it was his act of doing mercy Verse 37, not his empathetic feelings that fulfilled the commandment to love his neighbour. His movement toward the victim counteracted the victim's isolation and rejection. His bandaging of his wounds counteracted his physical violation and started him on the road to healing. In dressing the wounds, the Samaritan would have used his own possessions. The bandages were probably torn from his clothing or headgear, and the oil and wine would have come from his commercial cargo. Oil was a household remedy for pain relief, and wine was commonly used as a disinfectant. Oil and wine were not only used as medicinal remedies, however, they also played an important role in temple worship as sacrificial libations. You don't need to posit elaborate allegorical associations to recognize an additional layer of symbolic significance in the Samaritan's use of oil and wine to minister to the victim. In showing practical concern for the welfare of the victim, irrespective of religious considerations, the Samaritan offers true worship to God. The prophet Micah declares that what God requires, more than 10,000 rivers of oil poured out in cultic worship, is justice, mercy, and humility. The Samaritan enacts the truth of this message in contrast to the priest and the Levite. They would have often poured oil and wine on the temple altar in Jerusalem in profound devotion, but they failed to manifest their spiritual worship in merciful justice toward the crime victim. It is the hated Samaritan who offers the worship of justice and mercy in pouring oil and wine on the victim's wounds and not just on the religious altar. Next, the Samaritan enlists his power to change the victim's circumstances. He put him on his own animal and brought him to an inn. He picked the defenseless man up in his arms, heaved him onto his mount, and removed him to a place of greater security. The implication of putting him on his own animal is that the Samaritan dismounted and went ahead on foot, leading the animal by a tether, like a servant boy. In seeking to transform the victim's circumstances, the Samaritan displays striking humility as well as astonishing courage. Once at the inn, and we always think of a local motel unit when we hear the word inn, nothing like that. Once at the inn, the Samaritan devotes time and attention to the victim's recovery, and he took care of him. The inn would have been a dirty and dangerous place, no luxury resort by any means. It would have been a square enclosure, open to the skies, with rows of stalls for animals and straw on the ground for their owners to sleep beside their beasts at night. Regarded as very unsafe places, especially for Jews to be. They imagined all kinds of terrible things going on, but it was safer than being out on the open road. So it was, moralists thought you should never go to an inn, but your options would be to be robbed on the roads. The Samaritan doesn't sleep, however. Instead, he tends the wounded man throughout the night. The victim is not abandoned for a second time, but is sustained in a relationship of sheltering care. He is not left alone. At daybreak, the Samaritan must depart on business, but the victim is not fit to travel yet, so the Samaritan, we're told, took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend." There are several remarkable details in this final scene of the story. One is the amount of money involved. It's estimated that 2 denarii would have covered room and board for several weeks. The Samaritan makes provision, in other words, for the long-term recuperation of the victim. He can't be there to nurse him back to health in person, so he deputizes the innkeeper to serve as his agent, instructing him to continue rendering the same care, it's the same verb in both cases, that he himself had offered overnight. By accepting payment in advance, the innkeeper bound himself to carry out this commission. This is the most extraordinary detail of all. the Samaritan enters into an open-ended financial arrangement with the innkeeper, promising to cover any further expenses he might incur. He writes him a blank cheque, in other words. His solemn promise, "I will repay you," was a legal formula for taking over someone's debt. His concern was that the injured man would be protected from being imprisoned or enslaved for unpaid bills at the end of his stay. Now, Samaritan's chances of being defrauded were considerable, but he makes himself vulnerable to extortion in order to spare the victim the possibility of subsequent victimization. That the Samaritan exhibits such concern for the future experience of the victim attests an important, though uncomfortable, truth for all engaged in community development work. And the truth is this: once aid is given to those in need, that act initiates a chain of events in which the provider of the aid remains morally implicated. It's well known, especially in humanitarian work, that every intervention has unintended consequences, and even benevolently intended interventions may sometimes have a damaging impact on the beneficiary. Those who intervene, therefore, are obliged to anticipate as best they can the likely consequences of their involvement and to address any unforeseen negative effects that may flow from them. Good intentions are not sufficient. Moral foresight is also required because well-meaning gestures can easily go awry. The Samaritan in the parable anticipates the possibility that the victim may end up being indebted to the innkeeper and therefore unrestored to wholeness. And so he assumes personal responsibility to mitigate this potentially destructive outcome. The Samaritan then not only draws the victim into a community of care, he ensures that this community will continue into the future as long as the victim has need of it. He makes sure that the victim will emerge from his time of convalescence into a position of independence and freedom. Charity alone can enslave. True justice seeks to restore autonomy and self-reliance. Almost finished. All in all, some 9 different actions are performed by the Samaritan. Such a level of detail in describing his deeds is because they enact in concrete terms what it really means to love one's neighbour as oneself. In essence, I suggest, it means loving others in the same way we love God. The two obligations cannot be separated. They constitute a single reality, just as our love for God must embrace all the dimensions of our personality, our heart, soul, mind, and strength. So too must our love for others. The Samaritan was engaged emotionally, physically, materially, socially, financially, and morally in reaching out to the dying man on the roadside. He goes well beyond what was minimally necessary to save his life, but shows superlative devotion, dedication to his full restoration. His restoration to community, the victim's restoration to community, that is a re-empowerment and a liberation, as well as a healing and a recuperation. And for that reason, the Samaritan's response qualifies as an exemplary demonstration of restorative justice in all its fullness. Just some concluding observations. So wake up. Here's the challenging bit. Here's the theological revisionism. The parable was told to a lawyer who asked Jesus to pronounce on the necessary conditions for inheriting eternal life. Right? Jesus replied by asking the lawyer about what the law says on the matter. The lawyer responds by nominating wholehearted love for God and love for neighbour as the law's most essential requirements. Jesus congratulates him on his right answer, orthos, his correct answer. And he tells him to do these commandments and he will gain life. Right? How do I gain eternal life? Do the commandments. But the lawyer is a lawyer after all, and so he asks Jesus for a definitive statement on exactly who is my neighbour. Clearly, if doing the law by loving one's neighbour is the critical requirement for entry to the new age, an unambiguous definition of the object of such love seems critically important, especially to a lawyer. Jesus responds to this question with the parable of the Good Samaritan. Then he invites the lawyer to make his own interpretive judgment on the matter of neighbourliness. How does it seem to you, Jesus asks, which of these three men was a neighbour to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The question that Jesus asks at the end returns to the lawyer's original inquiry, but in a significantly modified form. It no longer focuses on the identity of the other as neighbour, but on the questioner's own identity as neighbour. It is not, who is my neighbour, but to whom am I a neighbour? There is a shift from object to subject, from recipient of compassion to agent of compassion, and with it a decisive shift from the realm of legal abstraction to the world of relational engagement. So which of the three men, the lawyer is asked, acted like a neighbour to the man in the ditch? Posed this way, only one answer is possible, for only one of the three characters did anything at all to benefit the victim. The one who showed him mercy, the lawyer replies. The lawyer, remember, had initially asked Jesus what he must do to win eternal life. And Jesus had responded he must do the law. Now, by now indicating that the Samaritan does mercy, the lawyer implies that the heretical outsider meets the requirement of doing the law and therefore opens the door of eternal life to himself. Jesus confirms this by issuing his second imperative to the lawyer: go you and do likewise. The present tense of the verb do underscores the constant or habitual nature of the specified action. Mercy is not a singular episode in one's dealing with others. It's a comprehensive way of life to which every individual is called. The message of the parable then, I suggest, is inescapable, and here it is. The continual practice of mercy is an essential individual requirement for entry to the age of salvation. Let that sink in. The continual practice of mercy is an essential individual requirement for entry to the age of salvation. The Samaritan qualifies to enter. The priest and the Levite do not. In this way, as one commentator puts it, the parable, quote, exposes any religion with a mania for creeds and an anemia for deeds, an uptightness about orthodoxy not matched by a parallel concern for orthopraxy. It also exposes any approach to criminal justice that places a concern for legal technicalities and professional decorum ahead of the actual needs of victims, and that diverts the wider social community from its overriding responsibility to work towards the restoration of victims to a place of health, strength, freedom, and autonomy. Nothing is said in the parable, of course, about the need to catch and punish the robbers, though the justice of doing so might be assumed. Nothing is said, this is often, I think even Augustine made this observation, nothing is said about what the kind-hearted Samaritan would have done had he arrived in the middle of the attack, though he might well have intervened in some non-violent way, I hope. Nothing is said, of course, about the need to make the highways safer for travellers, or about the value of drafting more police into the region to deter similar attacks in the future, though deterrence has its place and security is always worth considering. We are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, Martin Luther King observed. But one day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed, so that men and women will not be beaten and robbed constantly. True compassion is more than flinging a coin at a beggar. It comes to see that a system that produces beggars needs to be repaved. It's undoubtedly true. Agree wholeheartedly. But the parable doesn't address these larger systemic issues in detail, not because they're unimportant or unessential to consider in any comprehensive approach to law, crime, and social justice, but because the overriding concern of this story is the duty of restoration towards the victim and the priority of the victim's needs in the interpretation and administration of the law. Just one final comment. The parable is not actually totally silent about the need for systemic change, as King suggests. I've suggested in the book that the action of transporting the victim to the inn and enlisting the innkeeper in his future care involves a transformation of his environmental circumstances, and in that sense intimates the need for a kind of structural change. But the parable recognises, I think, that there is something far more difficult than achieving social or systemic change, and we all know that that's hard. But there's something even more difficult, and that something is becoming a truly loving person who engages all the powers of their personality on behalf of others. For that kind of love, we need more than political and social change. We need the power of God. As Paul writes, if I gave away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Now faith, hope, and love remain, these three, but the greatest of these is love. Thank you.